The heavy baton of the conductor froze mid-air as Glen Osorio, the Duke of Osorio, stepped into the center of the gilded ballroom with the weight of an oncoming storm. The sweeping strings of the waltz died into a jagged silence, the sudden quiet echoing louder than the music ever could. All eyes, wide with shock or narrowed with envy, tracked the Duke as he bypassed the clusters of preening debutantes and high-ranking lords. He moved with a predatory grace, his shadow lengthening across the polished floor until he stood directly before Elizabeth Larry. Elizabeth was shivering, her fingers digging into the worn silk of her skirts as she tried to blink back the moisture in her eyes. Moments before, the room had been filled with the snickering whispers of her peers, a cruel chorus labeling her the invisible charity case of the winter season. But as the Duke reached out, the room went cold with a different kind of tension. He did not bow with the empty politeness of the ton, instead, he caught her hand in a grip that was surprisingly warm and utterly possessive. "The music has stopped because it was unworthy of its muse," Glen remarked, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried to the furthest reaches of the hushed gallery. The mockery that had been ripening on the lips of the elite withered instantly. Elizabeth looked up, her breath hitching as she met the Duke's dark, unreadable gaze. For a man who usually treated the world with glacial indifference, the intensity in his eyes was staggering. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear in a gesture that was scandalous enough to ruin a dozen reputations, yet he didn't seem to care. "I have a secret for you, Miss Larry," he whispered, the heat of his breath sending a jolt through her that made her knees weak. "By tomorrow, every soul in this room will be bowing at your feet, and I will be the one holding the leash. But only if you can handle the price of the pretense." Before she could gasp or find her voice, he straightened, his fingers interlacing with hers as he turned to face the stunned crowd. He didn't ask her for a dance, he claimed her entire evening with a single look. Elizabeth felt the world shifting beneath her feet. The Shadow Duke, a man whispered to be as dangerous as he was wealthy, had just pulled her from the fringes of the room and thrust her into a spotlight so bright it burned. She was no longer invisible, but as the first notes of a new, more somber melody began to play, she realized that being seen by Glen Osorio might be the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to her. The frost on the window panes of the Larry estate mirrored the coldness that had settled in Elizabeth's chest. The winter gala was supposed to be a celebration, but for her, it was an exercise in endurance. She stood near the refreshment table, the hem of her lavender silk dress, a shade too muted for the vibrant season, blending into the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains. She had become an expert at the art of being ignored, a wallflower whose only purpose was to provide a contrast to the blooming beauties of the season. "It truly is a marvel," a voice rang out, sharp and high-pitched. It was Lady Catherine, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her cruelty. She stood at the center of a small, rapt circle, her gaze sliding toward Elizabeth with practiced disdain. How some families persist in parading their failures year after year. One would think that after 3 seasons of silence, a girl would have the decency to retire to the country and leave the floor to those of us with actual futures. The circle erupted into stifled titters. Elizabeth felt the heat crawl up her neck, her vision blurring as she stared down at her empty punch glass. She was a failure, a charity case, a ghost haunting the very halls she was born to inhabit. The social execution was swift and public, and not a single soul moved to offer her a reprieve. Then, the air in the room shifted. A sudden, heavy silence fell over the guests, starting at the entrance and rippling outward like a wave. The laughter died in Lady Catherine's throat as the crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of a primal, instinctive fear. Glen Osorio, the Duke of Osorio, strode into the light. He did not look at the host, he did not acknowledge the music. His dark, piercing gaze was locked onto the corner where Elizabeth stood trembling. He stepped into the circle, his massive frame dwarfing Lady Catherine, who suddenly looked very small and very pale. "I find," the Duke said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, "that those who speak loudest of others' failures are usually the most desperate to hide their own insignificance." He didn't wait for a response. He didn't even grant Catherine the mercy of a second look. Instead, he stopped directly in front of Elizabeth. The room was so silent that the crackle of the fireplace sounded like a thunderclap. "Miss Larry," he said, extending a gloved hand that looked like it could crush stone, yet remained perfectly steady. "I have found the company in this room intolerable until this very moment. Will you walk with me, or must I endure the rest of this evening in misery?" Elizabeth stared at his hand, then up at the man everyone called the Shadow Duke. In one stroke, he had silenced the vultures and elevated the wallflower. As she placed her hand in his, she realized the winter had only just begun, and the heat radiating from him was more dangerous than the cold she had left behind. The heavy oak doors of the library clicked shut, sealing out the distant hum of the ballroom and leaving Elizabeth alone in the dim, amber glow of the hearth with the Duke of Osorio. The air here was thick with the scent of old leather and the sharp, metallic tang of the winter night still clinging to his black velvet coat. Glenn did not move to the center of the room. Instead, he crowded her into a shadowed alcove between the towering bookshelves, his presence an overwhelming wall of heat and dark intent. "Why?" Elizabeth found her voice, though it was little more than a ragged whisper. Why would the Shadow Duke pluck a social ghost from the corner of a room to defend her honor? Glenn leaned in, his gloved hand coming to rest on the wood paneling just beside her head, trapping her. "Because, Miss Larry, the world thinks I am a monster, and they think you are a saint. I need a shield, and you need a sword. My family's estate is under siege by creditors who demand a marriage to stabilize the Osorio line, and your family is one breath away from selling you to the highest bidder just to pay your father's gambling debts." He leaned closer still, his eyes tracking the frantic pulse at the base of her throat. "Pretend to be my fiancée. For the next 12 days, let the ton believe I have finally met my match. I will pay your family's debts and give you a dowry that will make you the most independent woman in England." Elizabeth felt the world tilting. It was a lifeline wrapped in a scandal. "And what is the catch, Your Grace? A man like you does not give without taking." A slow, predatory smile pulled at the corners of his mouth, one that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "There is only one rule, Elizabeth. To make this believable, the world must see a woman who is utterly consumed by me. In public, you will look at me as if you crave my touch. You will lean into me, you will whisper in my ear, you will be the picture of a lady lost in passion." He dropped his voice to a low, guttural rasp that made her skin prickle. "But the moment the doors close and we are alone, you must treat me with nothing but the coldest disdain. You are to hate me in private. You must remember that every touch, every look, is a lie. If you let a single genuine feeling slip through that emerald heart of yours, the game is over, and we both burn." Elizabeth gasped, her lungs suddenly unable to pull enough air from the narrow space between them. The rule was a paradox, a breathless dance between a manufactured heaven and a very real hell. She looked into his dark eyes and saw the trap, but as she thought of the sneering faces in the ballroom, she realized she would rather be the Duke's beautiful lie than the ton's pathetic truth. "I can hate you, Your Grace," she whispered, her defiance sparking. "That might be the easiest part of the bargain." "Good," Glenn murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before he straightened, the icy mask sliding back into place. "Then let us go back out and give them something to scream about." The golden double doors of the ballroom swung open, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Elizabeth stood at the threshold, her arm threaded through Glenn's, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was no longer dressed in muted lavender. Tonight, she wore a gown of midnight velvet that clung to her curves like a second skin, its bodice shimmering with sapphires that caught the light with every breath. "Remember the rule, Elizabeth," Glenn murmured, his voice so low it was felt rather than heard. He didn't look at her, his gaze was fixed forward, cold and imperious, but he pulled her hand closer until her knuckles pressed against the hard muscle of his forearm. "The eyes of the wolves are upon us. Give them a feast." As they descended the grand staircase, the music faltered. The same voices that had dismantled Elizabeth's dignity days ago now fell into a paralyzed hush. Elizabeth took a slow, deliberate breath and leaned into him. She allowed her shoulder to brush against his, tilting her head toward him with a soft, lingering gaze that suggested a world of shared secrets. She practiced the crave, a softening of her features, a slight parting of her lips, a way of looking at the Duke as if he were the sun and she was a flower reaching for the light. The reaction was instantaneous. Lady Catherine dropped her fan, her mouth agape, while the rest of the ton leaned in, their whispers no longer mocking but frantic with disbelief. When they reached the dance floor, Glenn turned her into his arms. The public performance was visceral. His large hand splayed across the small of her back, pulling her inches closer than decorum allowed. Elizabeth played her part with terrifying precision. She let her fingers trail up his lapel to toy with the silver silk of his cravat, her eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made the surrounding guests gasp. To the onlookers, she was a woman intoxicated by her lover. To Elizabeth, every touch was a calculated strike against those who had called her invisible. "You're doing well," Glenn whispered as he spun her, his face inches from hers. To the crowd, it looked like a lover's confidence. To Elizabeth, the ice in his dark eyes remained unbroken. "They are convinced." "I told you I was a quick study, Your Grace," she replied, her smile radiant and false for the benefit of the room, even as she felt the stinging irony of the rule. As the waltz reached its crescendo, Elizabeth leaned her head back, exposing the line of her throat to him in a gesture of total surrender that left the ballroom breathless. She was the star of the winter season, the envied prize of the Shadow Duke. But as she caught her reflection in a nearby mirror, glowing, beautiful, and utterly entwined with the man she was supposed to hate, she realized the most dangerous part of the performance wasn't the lie they were telling the world, but the ease with which her body was beginning to believe it. The heavy iron gates of the Osorio estate swung shut behind the carriage, signaling the end of the evening's theater. Inside the plush, velvet-lined interior, the atmosphere shifted with a violence that made Elizabeth's head spin. Only moments ago, Glenn had held her waist with a proprietary heat that had convinced every witness of his devotion. Now, as the carriage lamps flickered across his face, his expression was as immovable as a tombstone. He sat on the opposite bench, the sprawling distance between them feeling like a physical canyon. He didn't look at her. Instead, he stared out the window at the passing skeletal trees, his jaw set in a line of pure granite. The hand that had lingered so possessively on her skin was now tucked into his pocket, hidden away as if the very touch of her had been a chore. "You were nearly late with your laughter during the toast," Glenn said, his voice stripped of the honeyed warmth he had used in the ballroom. "It was a cold, clinical observation. If we are to maintain this, your timing must be impeccable. I am paying for perfection, Elizabeth, not hesitation." The transition was so jarring it left Elizabeth gasping. The crave she had performed all night had left her nerve endings raw, her body still humming from the artificial closeness. To be met with this sudden, biting frost was like being plunged into ice water after a fever. "I am doing exactly as you asked, Your Grace," she replied, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain as cold as he was. "I followed your rule. I hated you the moment the carriage door closed. Is that not enough?" "It is exactly what is required," he snapped, finally turning his dark eyes toward her. There was no fire in them, only a hollow, echoing distance. "Do not mistake the performance for the reality. When we are in public, you are the center of my world because it serves a purpose. When we are here, you are a business partner. Nothing more." He reached out, not to touch her, but to pull the heavy silk curtain shut, plunging her side of the carriage into darkness. The rejection felt sharper than any insult Lady Catherine had ever hurled. Elizabeth leaned back against the cold leather, her chest aching with a phantom heat she couldn't extinguish. She was supposed to hate him, it was the rule that kept her safe, but as she watched his silhouette in the shadows, she realized that the Duke's icy distance was more suffocating than his public embrace. He was keeping his heart behind stone walls, and Elizabeth was beginning to realize that the more he pushed her away in private, the more desperate she was becoming to find the man hiding beneath the ice. The following evening, the grand music room of the Osorio estate was swallowed by shadows, illuminated only by the dying embers in the fireplace and a single candelabra atop the piano. Glenn had dismissed the servants, insisting that their rehearsal required absolute secrecy. He stood in the center of the parquet floor, his coat discarded, his white linen shirt open at the throat. He looked less like a duke and more like a restless spectre. "The waltz is the most dangerous part of the masquerade," Glenn said, his voice echoing coldly against the high ceilings. "It is where the tongue looks for a break in the rhythm, a moment of hesitation that reveals the lie. Come here." Elizabeth stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. Following the private hate rule, she kept her expression guarded and her movements stiff. As she reached him, Glenn didn't wait for her to settle. He reached out and caught her waist, pulling her flush against him with a suddenness that forced a soft gasp from her lips. "You are retreating, Elizabeth," he murmured, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Even in private, your body must learn the memory of mine. If you flinch when I touch you in the ballroom, the game is lost." He began to move, guiding her through the steps of a silent waltz. Without the music, every sound was amplified, the slide of leather soles on wood, the rustle of her skirts, and the heavy, synchronized beat of their hearts. The physical proximity was overwhelming. Elizabeth could feel the heat radiating from his chest, the strength in the hand splayed across her back, and the scent of sandalwood and rain that seemed to coat her senses. She tried to summon the coldness he demanded. She tried to think of his biting words in the carriage, his clinical dismissals, and his icy distance. But as he spun her, his hand tightened just a fraction, and his thumb brushed against the bare skin of her shoulder. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her that burned away her resolve. She looked up, intending to offer a sharp retort, but the words died in her throat. Glenn was looking down at her, and for the first time, the icy mask had cracked. There was a raw, aching hunger in his gaze that had nothing to do with the performance. His breath hitched, his face descending until they were mere inches apart, their lips ghosting over one another in the heat of the dance. That hate rule felt like a fragile glass wall under a hammer. Elizabeth's fingers, which were supposed to be rigid, curled into the fabric of his shirt, seeking the very connection he had forbidden. For a heartbeat, the lie was gone, replaced by a truth so powerful it made her head swim. Then, as quickly as the moment had sparked, Glenn wrenched himself away, his face hardening into a mask of stone once more. "That is enough for tonight," he rasped, his back turned to her. "Remember the rule, Elizabeth. Do not mistake the rehearsal for the reality." He walked out of the room without looking back, leaving Elizabeth standing in the flickering candlelight, her body still vibrating from a touch that was supposed to mean nothing, but had changed everything. The following morning, a restless Elizabeth found herself wandering the restricted west wing of the Osorio estate. The air here was colder, smelling of dust and stagnant time. In Glenn's private study, the door stood slightly ajar, a golden sliver of light spilling onto the carpet. Driven by a need to understand the man who held her so close in public only to freeze her out in private, she stepped inside. On the mahogany desk sat a heavy, iron-bound ledger and a series of frantic correspondences from the High Court. Elizabeth hesitated, then leaned in. As she read, the blood drained from her face. That Shadow Duke was not merely a brooding aristocrat, he was a man standing on a precipice. The Osorio line had been tainted by a scandal of his father's making, a massive embezzlement of crown funds that had left the estate bankrupt and Glenn's reputation hanging by a thread. But it was the personal letters that made her breath hitch. They were from Glenn's mother, written from a secluded asylum. She spoke of the Osorio curse, a volatile madness brought on by intense emotional passion that had driven his father to ruin. "So that is why," she whispered, the paper trembling in her hand. "Curiosity is a dangerous trait in a business partner, Elizabeth." She whirled around. Glenn stood in the doorway, his silhouette imposing and dark. He didn't look angry, he looked exhausted, his eyes reflecting a hollow, ancient fear. "You think I am cold because I am cruel," he said, stepping into the room. The space seemed to shrink as he approached. But I have seen what love does to the men of my blood. It turns into an obsession that burns everything it touches. My father loved my mother so violently he stole from the king to keep her in diamonds, and when the madness took him, he left us with nothing but a name people spit on. He stopped inches from her, his voice dropping to a jagged rasp. I made that rule to protect you from the man I might become if I let myself feel anything real. I need you to hate me, Elizabeth. I need your disdain to be the anchor that keeps me in the shadows. If you look at me with kindness when the doors are closed, I won't be able to stop the fire from consuming us both. The realization hit her like a physical blow. His distance wasn't a rejection of her, it was a desperate act of self-preservation. He wasn't a monster, he was a man terrified of his own heart. For the first time, Elizabeth didn't see the Shadow Duke, she saw a lonely boy guarding a crumbling fortress. The hate rule was no longer a game of social survival, it was a prison Glenn had built for himself, and Elizabeth realized with a sinking heart that she no longer had the strength to stay on the outside of its walls. The following night, the library was a tomb of silence, the only light provided by the dying embers of a fire that struggled to stay alive. Glenn sat at his desk, his head in his hands, the weight of the Osorio debt and the terror of his own bloodline bowing his broad shoulders. When the door creaked, he didn't look up, his voice coming out like crushed gravel. Go to bed, Elizabeth. The rule still stands. We are alone, and I have no desire for your company. In the past, his frost would have sent her fleeing. But the image of the boy in the letters, the boy who had been taught to fear his own heart, acted as a shield against his bitterness. Instead of retreating, Elizabeth walked toward him, her footsteps soft on the Turkish rug. She didn't stay in the shadows, she stepped into the amber light of the desk lamp. I am breaking the rule, Glenn, she said, her voice steady and warm. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and sharp with warning. You are playing with fire. Get out before I. Before you what? Act like a man who cares. She reached out, and before he could recoil, she placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm, a shocking contrast to the icy tension radiating from him. You are not your father. You are not a curse. You are just a man who has been cold for too long. Glenn froze. The touch was simple, devoid of the theatrical hunger of the ballroom, but it hit him with the force of a physical blow. He tried to pull away, to reclaim the safety of his disdain, but Elizabeth moved closer, her other hand coming up to cup his jaw. She looked at him with a kindness so pure it felt like a knife through his armor. You told me to hate you because you're afraid of being loved, she whispered. But hate is just as heavy as passion, Glenn. Let go of the weight. The Duke's composure, built over decades of fear and stone-cold discipline, didn't just crack, it shattered. A low, ragged sound escaped his throat, half sob and half growl. He surged out of his chair, his hands flying to her waist, not with the calculated proprietary grip of the Shadow Duke, but with the desperate, shaking cling of a drowning man. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hot and uneven against her skin. I told you to stay away, he rasped, his fingers digging into the velvet of her dress. I told you I would burn us both. Then let it burn, Elizabeth replied, her arms winding around him, holding him tight against the world. The man who usually silenced rooms with a single glance was now trembling in her arms. In breaking his rule, she had stripped him of his only defense, leaving them both standing in the wreckage of his pride, gasping in a heat that was no longer a lie. The ballroom of the Osorio estate was a cathedral of ice and light, draped in white roses and silver pine. Every chandelier was ablaze, casting a harsh glow on the faces of the ton, who stood like a phalanx of silent judges. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the predatory anticipation of a crowd waiting for a scandal to break. They had heard the rumors of the invisible Elizabeth Larry's sudden ascent, and they were here to watch the Shadow Duke's latest whim crumble. Elizabeth stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand trembling as it rested on Glenn's arm. She wore a gown of sapphire silk so deep it appeared almost black in the shadows, her throat adorned with the Osorio diamonds, stones that felt like frozen fire against her skin. Glenn stood beside her, his posture rigid, his face a mask of such terrifying perfection that for a moment, Elizabeth feared he had retreated back behind his walls of stone. "They are waiting for us to falter," Glenn whispered, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. "They are looking for the lie." "Then let us give them the truth," Elizabeth replied, her voice ringing with a newfound clarity. As they descended, the room fell into a suffocating silence. Lady Catherine stood at the base of the stairs, her eyes narrowed, her fan snapping shut like a gunshot. The performance began as it always did, with a lingering gaze and a possessive touch, but as they reached the center of the floor, the crave changed. When the music swelled into a haunting, sweeping waltz, Glenn didn't just lead her, he moved as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. In the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by hundreds of staring eyes, the Duke slowed his steps. He didn't wait for the song to end. He stopped, his large hands framing Elizabeth's face with a tenderness that made the room gasp. "I told you to hate me," he murmured, his dark eyes searching hers with a raw, searing vulnerability that no actor could mimic. "I told you it was the only way to stay safe from the fire." Elizabeth reached up, her fingers tangling in the dark hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer until their foreheads rested against each other. The tone faded into a blur of meaningless colors. "The fire is already here, Glenn. And I'm not afraid to burn." The performance shattered in that moment. It wasn't a scripted gesture or a calculated move to silence the gossips. It was a confession. Glenn leaned down, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was desperate, honest, and entirely scandalous. It wasn't the polite peck of a betrothed couple, it was the claim of a man who had finally found his way out of the dark. A collective breath hitched across the ballroom. The vultures were silenced, not by fear, but by the undeniable weight of a love that defied every rule they had lived by. The Shadow Duke had been unmasked, not as a monster or a fraud, but as a man who had finally stopped pretending to be cold. As they broke the kiss, Elizabeth saw the frustration in Lady Catherine's face turn to ash. The lie was dead, and in its place was a truth that would leave the world gasping forever. The morning after the ball, the Osorio study was flooded with a pale, winter sunlight that seemed to strip away the last of the manor's lingering shadows. There was no fire in the hearth, but the room felt warmer than it had in decades. Glenn stood by the window, his silhouette no longer a jagged, defensive edge against the light. In his hand, he held the vellum contract, the cold, legal heart of their business arrangement, its wax seal looking like a dried drop of blood. Elizabeth stood by the door, her heart suspended in a terrifying stillness. The performance was over. The creditors had been silenced, her family's debts were settled, and the world finally saw her as a woman of consequence. By every rule they had established, this was the moment she was supposed to pack her trunks and disappear back into the quiet life of a spinster, albeit a wealthy one. "The play has reached its final act," Glenn said, his voice devoid of the Duke's commanding boom. It was soft, hesitant, and entirely human. He looked down at the document, the paper that bound them to a lie, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he tore it down the center. He didn't stop until the fragments fell like snow onto the mahogany desk. "The rule is dead, Elizabeth. I cannot live another hour behind a mask, and I certainly cannot live another day with you hating me in private." He crossed the room, his movements lacking their usual predatory grace. He walked like a man who had finally put down a heavy burden. He stopped inches from her, reaching out to take her hands. His touch was no longer part of a performance for the ton, it was a silent plea. "I spent my life terrified that the fire in my blood would destroy anyone I let near," he whispered, his dark eyes brimming with a raw, shining honesty. "But you didn't burn, Elizabeth. You walked into the flames and brought me back to the light. I don't want a business partner. I don't want a shield. I want the woman who had the courage to break every rule I made." The Shadow Duke, the man who had silenced ballrooms with a look, sank slowly to one knee before her. The gesture was so humble, so utterly devoid of his former pride, that it left Elizabeth gasping. "Elizabeth Larry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I am asking you to stay. Not for the sake of the Osorio name or a social contract, but because I am utterly, hopelessly lost without you. Will you be my wife? Will you be the true Duchess of Osorio, and let us build a life where we never have to pretend again?" Elizabeth felt the last of her own defenses crumble. The wallflower had found her son, and the monster had found his peace. Tears blurred her vision as she pulled him upward, meeting him halfway in a kiss that tasted of salt and absolute freedom. "Yes," she breathed against his lips, the word a vow that echoed through the silent house. The masks were gone. There was no Duke, no wallflower, and no shocking rules, only two souls who had survived the winter to find a love that would never leave them breathless with fear again. Elizabeth was no longer a ghost in the shadows, she was the heart of the House of Osorio, and the fire they shared would burn bright for the rest of their lives.